Okay, hello everybody. My name is Anna Minton and I'm the author of Big Capital, Who is London For? And I would like to welcome to the stage Paul Sng, the director. Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour. Well, as you said earlier, Paul, your film came out just a week before Grenfell. My book came out 2 weeks before Grenfell. Grenfell was an event that seemed to change the landscape around housing actually forever. And so many of the issues that your film deals with around lack of representation of local communities, the complete failure to listen to local communities was completely reflected by what happened at Grenfell. And Jeremy, I just really wanted to ask you if you could reflect on the film in the light of Grenfell and that lack of local representation.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, it's an absolutely brilliant film. Congratulations on it. It's the first time I've seen it. Thanks also to Curzon for having on here tonight, because I understand you missed out on something much bigger in order to have this on, so thanks a lot for that. Yeah, I was at the Grenfell Memorial this morning, and I've been talking to former residents of Grenfell after the fire on many occasions. And I spoke to many outside St Paul's today, and they were very conflicted. They enjoyed the fact that there was recognition of their hurt and their loss by having this very big event at St Paul's. But they were full of anger that they hadn't been rehoused permanently or securely or safely, full of anger that the Royal Borough of Curzon Chelsea had failed to deliver the services for them that they're entitled to and deserve. And on a wider scale, I think their anger reflects the way in which a lot of working class communities have not seen investment in social housing or community benefit, and instead been seen as an opportunity for property speculation and asset strippers to come in all over the country. And I think that this film helps to frame that debate and how it goes on, and I've tried to set out the way I want policy development to go in what I said to our conference in September in Brighton, and the questions I've been putting to the government. I mean, there are more or less probably 15,000 people or thereabouts rough sleeping at any one time in this country. They're not a cause of the problem, they're a symptom of a much bigger and much wider problem. That the hostels are full, the move-on accommodation is not there, and beyond that there are tens of thousands of people living in very overcrowded, some cases council, some cases housing association, more likely private rented accommodation. And councils that build, some do, my own council does, I'm pleased to say, do their best to build. The reality is they're prevented from building by lack of ability to borrow against the asset value or income stream, and they're then forced into doing other things. What I want to do is allow councils to borrow against their asset stream, to invest in council housing at social rents with lifetime secure tenancies. And with that, we looked at the ability of the construction industry to build what we want, which is at least 500,000 homes, council homes over the period of a parliament, but also regulation of the private rented sector, because that is a fairly big and the idea that the starter homes being put up in London that are reality starter homes for people to buy into is kind of a joke. that people come into my advice around my constituency, and in the constituency I represent, I would imagine there are less than 20%, probably less than that, of the population that could remotely afford to buy anything in the private sector in that constituency because of the way prices have gone up, and so their only option is the private rented sector because council housing is in such desperately short supply. And the council, instead of being able to house people locally when they are in desperate need, homeless, emergency, high medical needs, all those sort of things, the only way they can be housed is be placed in the private rented sector, often outside the borough, and that causes community disruption. Children either lose school places or travel impossible journeys to stay in the same school because that's what they know as their home. We're just doing so much damage to so many children's lives by the inability to build the housing that's necessary and give people the security of tenure that they want. And so I'm looking at policies in the areas of building, of regulation, and of ending homelessness by providing sufficient emergency accommodation to deal with the emergency, which is what homelessness is, but deal with the longer term projections, which is if the benefit changes continue the way the government wants, then homelessness is likely to increase, not decrease, over the years. And so there are huge policy areas there, but fundamentally it is a human right to be housed. It is a requirement of government and of local authorities to be able to provide that housing that people need, and I'm very determined that we'll develop the policies that we'll put before people in an election as soon as it comes, so that we can say we are going to make it a national crusade, a national endeavour to deal with the housing crisis.
I know that certainly I myself, Paul, so many people in this audience were so pleased, relieved to hear your party conference speech and what you had to say about housing. You will have seen the stories in the film on Cressing Gardens, the Aylesbury estate. While people in this room are so pleased with your statement of intent, there is also, I think, great concern that actually there are many Labour councils in London who responded to that by saying that they will continue with these policies in Haringey, in Southwark, in Lambeth, and this statement of intent, which we support so much, a Labour government may not come soon enough for Cressing Gardens and the Aylesbury, which is facing its second public inquiry in January. Beverley will be going to her second public inquiry in January. So I just wonder what you might be able to say with regard to that.
Well, the fundamental point I put in the speech was that I do recognise the way in which councils have been denied the opportunity to borrow what they need, and I do recognise that they have difficulty in land supply and so on to build. I recognise all of that. But the fundamental point I put in it was there has to be community consent in what you do. And that's where I think that the problem lies. Now, I understand there is a legal process pending in the case of both of those events that are going on. There certainly is a pre-judicial review, judicial review, if you understand me, going on in Haringey at the present time, of which the judge has not yet given his ruling on whether it can go to a full judicial review. I understand also, whatever the result of that, either side will be open to appeal to it. So I think there's going to be no fundamental decision on Haringey very, very quickly on this. I fully understand the feelings of people on the ground in all three areas that you've mentioned, and that's, I hope that those councils will take into account the points that I put and the view that was put by a very large majority to a resolution that was agreed at Labour Party conference in September.
I think one of the problems is the councils are Labour in name. We look at areas like Lambeth, particularly in Cressing Gardens. Someone in the audience will probably give me the correct stat if I'm wrong, but I think in Cressingham they're only actually going to create another 16 or maybe 20 council homes. That is a crazy situation. I mean, Lambeth are heavily in debt, we know this, but what can you do as the leader of the Labour Party to influence these councils? I know that direct powers don't exist within your role, but what can you do as the leader?
To encourage the point I made on community consent, to encourage the points that have been put in the Labour Party conference decision that we took, and also look at the overall picture of what's happening in inner city areas all across the country. That's why I want to see development which is of social housing, council housing, on lifetime tenancies. We've been through many years of people proposing shorter-term tenancies, intermediate rents, commercial rent levels, and so on. But as the film quite correctly pointed out, and as Karen Buck put in the points that she made, it was that social housing model of the post-war consensus that actually did conquer the housing crisis. And as one who first came into local authority politics in the 1970s in Haringey, opposing the demolition of a number of streets around Finsbury Park because I felt they should have been refurbished rather than demolished. Eventually a public inquiry was held, eventually we won the case, they were refurbished and they're still there as very nice, very pleasant community streets around Finsbury Park, and it can be done. And I sometimes wonder if you can't improve areas by limited infill development if there's space to do it, improvements and refurbishment. But it also, the other area I want to look at for Labour government in the future is the models of management that go with it. In my own area we have a number of housing co-ops. They're not huge, but we do have a number. Generally speaking, housing co-ops work well. They give people a sense of community. They give a strong sense of community. I think those are areas that are worth looking at for development. But principally, it's about the determination to provide sufficient good quality housing. We have the most expensive and quite often the worst quality housing in many parts of Western Europe. There's no reason for that other than a lack of political will to do something about it. I certainly have that political will to do something about it.
Okay, we're going to throw it open to the audience. I know that there are going to be so many people wanting to ask questions, so I urge you that please ask brief questions, do not make long statements, and there are 2 people with mics who will be strict about that because we know there are so many questions. So if you do start making a long statement, I'm afraid you will be cut off. Sorry. We've got 2 rows of mics. We're going to take a question at a time and the mic is going to go to the second person to tee them up. So let's start with the lady over there, up there at the top. And we'll go to the lady in red. Over.
Can I ask my question in time?
Go on then.
Hi, my name is Paul Peters and I'm on the National Steering Group of Disabled People Against Cuts, DPAC. I'm really concerned about, we're not talking about universal credit and housing, and we're seeing with housing tenants, 50% of people, 50% of claimants evicted under universal credit is gathering apace, and social cleansing across London, across the country, is ramping up homelessness with universal credit. And sorry, Jeremy, but your position of pause and fix on universal credit is totally wrong. What you need to look at is the end game of universal credit is the abolition of the welfare state. It's the abolition of social housing, social tenants, and it's just going to literally cause an underground of homelessness, the likes of we've never seen, and we need you to relook at your position on that.
I'm not quite sure why you should say it is automatically the end of welfare state as a whole. As far as I'm concerned, universal credit is very unfair in the way it's been rolled out, they're very unfair in the way it works, they're very unfair in the way it increases and puts people into debt straight away, and sometimes leaves them waiting 6-12 weeks for money to come forward. And by putting in the benefit limit, including a housing cost, means it's grossly unfair to people in the private rented sector on high rents. What we've said is, halt it now, so that we can look at the totality of it and bring in a system which actually does protect or improve incomes, rather than cut them, which is what universal credit has generally done.
Yeah, but it's killing people, Jeremy, right now. We know people that are going to die. Deepak know people that are going to die from it. It's killing people right now.
Yeah, that's why, I understand what you're saying. Look, that's why we have made a huge demand regularly, and continue to, that universal credit rollout be stopped. We have demanded peripheral issues, but nevertheless significant ones, on being charged to phone in, for example, but also on the delays on payments. And the government's response has been to basically offer people a loan instead. No, if you're moving on from 2-week benefits to something else, then they should be paid for the gap before they move on to it. But at the moment, universal credit is actually working against the interests of a very large number of people. And as I was able to expose in Parliament a month ago, there are some landlords. I got a letter from a letting agent in Hull that had sent out a preemptive eviction notice to every single one of his tenants who were going to go on to universal credit on the basis that they would automatically go into rent arrears by doing so, and it would make it easier to evict them at the end of it. I think that is absolutely appalling, and that, if nothing else, is a reason why the rollout of universal credit should be stopped, and we should look again at the whole system.
Okay, thank you. I think it was the lady in red next.
I'm actually going to pass the mic over to this young lady, if I can take my question. It's about the law of legal reference.
Hi, sorry, I've just come from the memorial. I'm quite emotional. I was evacuated on the night of the fire, and my question is, I actually live on the other side of Grenfell Tower. As Beverly said, I'm one of the forgotten people. I suffer from mental health. I was put through hell through RBKC, who eventually said that I'm homeless, and they gave me a hostel unfurnished. When I asked for any help, I was told I was not in the catchment area, and it was through help through volunteers and the church that I received donations. So my question is, why is help and finance more based on the random geography than on psychological and emotional need? How do I get noticed when they have drawn random lines on the map to set limits for their help? I'm collateral damage, and I have not received much help through RBKC. Sorry, Jeremy, I've got a letter if I can give to you at the end, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. And we were discussing this morning outside the church on this. It is obvious that many people around Grenfell were really, really badly affected by it. And indeed, I talked to many a couple of days after the fire who had observed the fire, watched the fire, tried to help people who were escaping from it, and were totally part of and are totally part of that community, equally emotionally traumatised by it just as anyone else. And they, of course, should be included in the support that's needed. They should be given the help and care they need and should be recognised as victims of the fire, just like anybody else who is obviously a victim of the fire if they're within the building itself. I think we should be a bit more generous about it and recognise the needs of the entire community and the sense of community trauma that's affected everyone around Grenfell.
I think one of the issues that has meant that the situation with Grenfell, the people, that were not valued. And that comes down to many things, one of which is a big influence is the fact that people said in the film that council housing and the people that live in it have been demonised, have been stigmatised, and that's due to those terrible poverty porn shows. You know, you have on one hand those things like Benefit Street, and then they have other shows which I suppose are property porn, where it's, you know, buy your own home, aspire to this. And if you don't fit into those demographics, then, you know, where are you going to go? And I think one of the things I'd like to see from a Labour government would be a commitment to provide a council tenancy for any key worker, whether that's a nurse, a new teacher, a care worker, because what that will then do, that begins to change the perception of council housing. If people know that it's for nurses, it's for key workers, teachers, carers, they stop thinking that it's about, you know, housing for benefits guys or people that haven't made it in life. And I think one thing that perhaps you could do while you're in opposition is lobby Ofcom to actually try and get rid of these damaging stereotypes, because if, you know, TV programs, disabilities or people of colour, the way that they do to working class people, the way they do to people on estates, it wouldn't be allowed. So, you know, let's make poverty porn history. Let's do this.
You're absolutely right, and the demonisation of communities, it makes it easier for politicians to make decisions that are damaging to those communities. Look at what the underfunding went on in Grenfell. Look at the way in which the Grenfell Action Group were not listened to when they should have been. They said, in terms, they were worried about a catastrophic fire in that block, and there are plenty of other people around the country. The government was eventually persuaded that after Lacknell House, they ought to be putting sprinkler systems in tower blocks. As I understand it, not one local authority request, including ones from Westminster and others, to fund sprinkler systems has yet been granted. They ought to be all paid for by central government and not be paid for by cutting some other aspect of local authority services. But your other point about the need for key workers in areas is absolutely crucial, because in my own borough, I obviously know very well many people that work in the hospital, work for Royal Mail, work for social services, work for local authority and so on, and work in the fire service. Hardly any of the younger ones live anywhere in the borough at all. I spent a morning last year talking to people in the Royal Mail sorting office. Only 3 people in the entire sorting office lived anywhere near where they worked, because they simply couldn't afford to get anywhere to live. The only ones that lived, they were much older workers who bought places or got council places many years ago. And so I would say that yes, key worker housing on estates in council properties is a very valuable thing to do, because it again shows the importance we give to people that are doing a key job within our community. And but it is about fundamentally building enough council places to meet the demand. And what we've seen since Margaret Thatcher introduced right to buy was a number of people made a lot of money out of right to buy by selling them on at the first possible opportunity. 40% of all places that have been sold under right to buy are now being rented out in the private rented sector. And so I have examples in my own community where you get a council flat of £100 a week and you get a right to buy place next door bringing £400 a week. We, the public, are paying the difference often through housing benefit bill of £11 billion a year paid directly into private landlords in mainly places, not exclusively, but mainly places that have been done under right to buy.
Okay, great. Well, look, we're running out of time, so I want to take quick questions. One over there, the guy in the frame.
We've still got this one to answer up here, actually.
That's one question I really want to ask though.
No, hang on.
I've got the mic.
Let's identify three questions and then
Beverly in the red, first of all, sorry.
Jeremy, can I just say, Jeremy, I'm a right to buy person, and I actually work for a living. I wasn't on benefit. But the question I would like to ask you, because I'm faced with being homeless through regeneration, if the local authority would reinstate and acknowledge the Light for Life policy, which means a comparative transaction, getting a new home for an old home, would this not take away the social cleansing of leaseholders like myself who are placed on a regeneration site in losing their home and have to challenge a tribunal or a public inquiry to get fairness for our homes, to get fair value for our homes? What do you propose to do about this as our leader?
We haven't, quite honestly, we haven't decided exactly what we're going to do on that. I want to think quite carefully about that. But I think your point is fundamentally right. That you should, if you're losing your home through demolition, regeneration, or whatever title is used for it, then you should be guaranteed an equivalence of what you're in at the present time. That seems to be equitable and fair. But my wider concern about the effects of right to buy has been, obviously not in your case, but has been, in many cases, the homes have then been sold on and are now in the private rented sector and now becoming very, very expensive to live in, not available for people that desperately need housing through social housing, and often paid for through housing benefit bills, which we don't benefit from because there's no extra housing from it. I would rather we spent less on housing benefit in the private rented sector and instead invested far more money in building homes for people to live in the long term for the future.
So commit to repealing
Okay, let's take the guy in the grey and the lady up there.
I have to say about what you said about the private rented sector though. I just have to say...
Wait for the microphone, nobody can hear you.
Just have to make it 10 minutes. I've got to make this point because this is... Right, okay. Sorry.
First of all, thank you for coming to actually watch the documentary, even though it wasn't always shining Labour in the best light. But one thing that I really, really do want to ask you is, we constantly hear that we need to make more council homes. The last budget, there was nothing about council homes, it was all about affordable housing. That's relative to what people have got in terms of their wealth. But the thing that I have to ask is, on my street, Emily Thornberry is my MP, and I live on a street that is mixed of housing association, council, private rented, and we had this flat on our street that was empty for ages and ages. And I said to my old neighbour, who's part of the housing association, I said, "Oh, Michael, like, what's going on down there?" And he's like, "Oh, 9 years ago, that was completely desolate." Basically, I'm not going to waffle on, but what I'm trying to say is, it got sold off by auction for £215,000 about 3 years ago, bought up privately. It was inflated by £100,000 3 days later. And then it went on the market by Foxtons for £515,000. When why wasn't it put back into the social housing market? And it's happened the same thing in Wandsworth, where I grew up. And I grew up in a lovely household where we had good schools, good playing fields, and now it's been sold off so that can be like turned into flats for private rental. And that's what I want to know is why we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
Well, should we let Jeremy take that?
Yeah, housing associations selling places on the open market, which they do by auction, is just totally wrong. Housing associations are set up to provide social housing. Selling them on the open market, which some of them do some of the time, claiming that it's the only way they can fund the future development, means that we end up with less and less housing that people in desperate housing need, and many housing associations building for sale. And I spend a lot of time in negotiation with them and objecting to what they're proposing in my own area, because there isn't sufficient social housing going into it. Otherwise, if it doesn't, then inner London areas, indeed the whole of London, becomes a centre for social cleansing as people get forced to move out. There's insufficiency there. So, yeah, I mean, I realise there wasn't sufficient in the budget to improve housing stock. That's why I wanted to get rid of this government.
Okay, I know that there are a lot of people that want to ask Jeremy questions.
You can't talk the politician way to say us what we want to hear, but in reality, you didn't even condemn those councillors who are socialists,
Yes. Like in Harringay, where you haven't stopped Harringay councillors going against national policy.
Okay.
That's what they do.
I've been told that time is up.
There's one
Jeremy says we can take one more. How I'm going to choose that one, I don't know. Okay, we'll take the one over there. As the executive. Okay, question over here.
Last question, sorry, I won't be such a matter. Last question. I was born in council housing. My family would have been absolutely homeless if we didn't have social housing in 1971 when I was born. I'm proud to say that I'm Paul's business partner in this film. I funded the film. What I'd like to hear from Jeremy is an absolute yes or no. Would you, if you got into power, straight when you get into power, I'd like to, so I'm not just going to go, but one thing after working in social housing for the past 6 years, I need, and everyone needs, people like Beverly in the red there, who I've worked with for 4 years, we need someone to say that we will stop the absolute unnecessary demolition of social housing. But more importantly, every social housing estate should have a residence ballot. It's really simple. We vote for you. If you didn't vote today, if we could go forward, hang on, if we could go forward and vote. If you live on a social housing estate, you should be able to vote for your estate.
I made that very clear in what I said to Party Conference and what's put in the resolution that was agreed and put forward by Tottenham Labour Party, that there has to be community consent for these issues to go forward. I want a government that's prepared to invest in council housing, that is prepared to make sure they are lifetime secure tenancies, that will regulate the private rented sector, that will end homelessness and will say that housing is an issue that affects us all, that if we don't address it, more and more children underachieve and are brought up in appalling conditions, more and more people become homeless. We have to change track completely on housing, and I'm very determined to do just that. You didn't answer the question.
I'm afraid that that is all that we've got time for. But I think, can we please all join in thanking Paul very much? Thank you, Jeremy very much.
Thank you to Anna as well for hosting the Curzon hosting the film too. Here, and done, sell some DVDs, quick.